I was in Warsaw, in Poland, for a week because I had rehearsals and a concert there. But on the Wednesday, Thursday and Friday of that week, I also had to do rehearsals in Berlin.
Oh.
I needed to be able to have the rehearsal in Warsaw in the morning, then fly to Berlin for the rehearsal there in the late afternoon, and then straight back to Warsaw late at night in time for the next morning rehearsal.
Oh.
The only way to get to Berlin and back in time was to fly, so I hired an air taxi.
Oh.
As soon as I left the rehearsal, there was a car waiting to take me to the airport. And when I arrived at the airport, my heart sank because the weather was not so good.
Oh.
And the operations manager said, "Look, I'm terribly sorry. We can't fly at the moment because of the weather." Finally, the weather cleared and they said we could fly. So I was still hoping to make it in time for my rehearsal. However, we got into the plane and I didn't have a very good impression of it. It looked a bit old.
Oh.
And there was a little hole where the air was coming through where the door had been shut on my side.
Oh, no.
I thought, well, never mind, and I put on my seatbelt and finally we took off. The weather was not good, and after about 5 or 10 minutes I was terribly cold, and I thought, well, I know it can be cold, and it was also very noisy. Normally they give you headphones, but for some reason they didn't. So the noise was very loud, and it got very, very cold.
Oh.
And then, to my horror, I realised that the co-pilot's door wasn't shut properly. By this point, the co-pilot himself had realised that the door wasn't shut. So he turned to me and said, "Problema." And then he started gesticulating to the pilot, who was already having difficulties because the weather was very bad and it was raining very hard and there was a bit of a storm. I was feeling extremely uncomfortable by now, wishing that I was on the ground. But then came the real drama, because the pilot was trying to indicate to the co-pilot how to shut the door properly. Now, what do you do if you're driving a car and you realise that you haven't shut the door properly? You usually stop, open the door again, and then shut it with a bang, or sometimes you don't even stop. You just, while you're driving slowly, you do that. Anyway, this idiotic co-pilot, he proceeded to do precisely that. He then opened the door completely in order to shut it properly, and I was just behind them, as this is a small plane, so right in front of me was just open air. This open door, I was absolutely terrified, cold air rushing in, and then he tried to shut it properly, but presumably because of the pressure or the cold, I don't know what, he couldn't do so. And had he not had his seatbelt on, he would have fallen out of the plane. So he was holding on, partly for dear life, partly to try and shut it, unsuccessfully. The pilot was shouting at him, but he couldn't correct the situation because, you know, he had to keep the plane in the air, which was now extremely precarious, and the plane was going up and down. Then suddenly I felt that we were going right down, and I prayed that we were going to land. To my relief, we landed in one piece, so at least my life was no longer in danger. But as far as the rehearsal was concerned, I realised with horror that because of this emergency in the air, the pilot had had to land at the nearest town, which was still quite a long way from Berlin. I had to phone the rehearsal people to say I was going to be late, and I was feeling thoroughly miserable. However, we eventually took off and arrived in Berlin, and I did my rehearsal, and fortunately it had been the type of rehearsal where my lateness had not caused a real problem. Then on the way back, the pilots were waiting for me at the airport. This was now about 10 o'clock at night or 9:30. So this time we took off, and I said, "Are you quite sure the door is properly shut? Quite sure?" And they said, "Yes, yes." And I said, "We're very late now. I want you to get back to Warsaw as fast as possible." And they said, "Yes, the wind is in our favour. This aircraft can go very fast. We should be back soon in Warsaw. Don't worry, everything will go fine." So we took off, and things were, well, nothing was going particularly wrong, but I noticed that they were going rather slowly, but it was still so noisy that I couldn't communicate with them and ask, "Why are you going so slowly?" Eventually, when we landed, I said, "Why were you going so slowly? I told you to go as fast as possible." And the pilot said, "I'm terribly sorry, I didn't know this plane very well, and we were having a fuel problem, so we're running out of fuel." So on the way there, I'd nearly fallen to the ground through an open door, and now we'd been in danger of falling to the ground because of lack of fuel.